welcome to my video. This is the first video that I'm making in regards to lupus, which is a condition that I have suffered with for over 50 years. And today I've decided that I'm going to make a video. So I just want to talk you through my journey with lupus, how it affects me, how I was diagnosed, and how it has changed my life. So I was diagnosed with lupus around 2004, 2005, and the diagnosis was really important for me because for many years, for as far back as I can remember being a child, I always had symptoms, and these symptoms would vary. They would come and they would go. Sometimes they'd be mild, sometimes the symptoms would come with severity, and I didn't know what it was. My parents didn't know what it was. The doctors didn't know what it was. So when I was diagnosed at the age of 35, it was a relief to have a name to these symptoms that I was experiencing. But I want to take you right back to the beginning and chart my journey. So when my first memory of having any kind of illness was around the age of about 4 or 5, and I can always remember experiencing swelling in my joints. My joints were always tender, always sore, and I remember crying because of how I was feeling. But you know, being a young child, the doctors put it down to growing pains, so you know, nobody really took it seriously. And then when I got to the age of about 10, 11, I can remember being in the most horrendous pain, and my joints were constantly stiff. I would have lots of fever. I'd be having time off school and just being generally feeling really unwell. And I can always remember my mother taking me to the doctor, and I think in her mind it was so that she can be satisfied, and hopefully I could be satisfied, that there was nothing wrong with me. So my mother took me to the doctor and was horrified when the doctor diagnosed me with juvenile arthritis. That really was my main early diagnosis of lupus, only I didn't realise it back then. So having been diagnosed with juvenile arthritis at the age of about 10 or 11, I used to experience real stiffness of the joints and pain and swelling and fever. So throughout my teenage years, it was just symptomatic. I don't remember being on any medication other than just occasional painkillers. The pain came and went because I remember through my teenage years there'd be certain times where I was very swollen and in a lot of pains, and other times that I remember being absolutely fine. I do remember though that I was always a slow walker. I think that was about the pain and the stiffness in my hips that always slowed me down, and I would always be really fatigued after any sort of activity. I sailed through my teenage years with all the classic aching joints, aching knees, hips, my fingers, my elbows, my shoulders, everything ached and you know, was painful. So when I left school and I started working again, you know, I remember I worked in a hospital and having to go to occupational health because what started to transpire at this time was my blood count was really low. And what happened back in those days is when you started working for an employer or for the hospital, they would send you off for a routine medical check. And mine came back as I was very severely anemic, which would then explain the tiredness, the fatigue, and of course the pain and the swelling in the joints. So I was put on a course of iron tablets. And this was my pattern throughout my teenage years and early adulthood, was I would be in pain, I would have the joint pains, the swelling and the anemia. I also went through a period where I was suffering with migraine headaches as well, but those sort of tapered off. And then because of the pain that I was experiencing in my joints, I found it difficult to exercise and to move, and therefore the weight started to come on. I started to gain weight, which of course didn't help my overall situation. I also at that time just thought everybody had achy joints, achy knees, achy fingers, because to me, I'd lived with it now for the best part of childhood and adulthood, and assumed that everybody had aching joints, sore joints, occasional anemia, and needed pain tablets. It was just normalized to me. I just assumed everybody was like that, and that wasn't the case. I later came to discover. The next significant stage was when I had my son in my late 20s, and again this was another sign of the lupus, but of course I didn't know because I hadn't been diagnosed. And I had a challenging pregnancy, and my pregnancy only went for 7 months, and I delivered by cesarean section my son sort of 9 weeks early, and that was because I developed preeclampsia. And preeclampsia is a very dangerous condition. It's a life-threatening condition both for mother and baby in pregnancy, and I developed that, so had to have emergency cesarean section. After my son was born, within the first year, my body, going through pregnancy and giving childbirth, had experienced trauma, which most women's bodies do when you have a baby. But in my case, my body went totally haywire, and that was because of the lupus. But again, I didn't know, the medics hadn't picked it up. And within a few months of me giving birth to my son, my fatigue was just off the scale. It was off I couldn't function normally. The fatigue was so dramatic, and no matter how much I had rested or slept, it just wasn't enough. And then I started to experience symptoms where I couldn't bend my fingers in a normal fashion. I just couldn't bend my fingers like that without my fingers locking, and it was then impossible to bend them. And then when I could bend them, they were extremely painful and swollen. And the same happened with my toes. My toes used to lock, and I just couldn't bend my toes, curl my toes. I'd wake up in the night, and it was like rigor mortis had set in my fingers and in my toes, and I just could not bend them. I started experiencing severe pains in my knees and my hips again, and these pains got to the point where I just couldn't function. So I went along to the doctor and I said, look, you know, something is not right. I need some tests being conducted. So my doctor automatically thought, let's test for RA, which is rheumatoid arthritis. And the tests came back that it wasn't RA. although it came back that I was quite severely anemic. So again, being treated for the anemia. And a few months later, my symptoms persisted and had more tests done. Doctor couldn't find anything significant. So at this point, I'm thinking, well, you know, I feel like something's wrong. I'm not sure what it is. Doctor's saying that there's nothing. I haven't got RA, the classic that he thinks it is. And so he popped me on more painkillers. And I lived with this, the fatigue, the pain, not being able to function, not being able to bend my fingers. So that meant I couldn't comb my hair, I couldn't get dressed, I couldn't cook properly. There were times I just couldn't get out of bed. I was just, it was literally like somebody had pulled the electricity plug out of me, and my energy just literally wound down and down and down. To give you it was like a fan that was going round, and once you switch it off, it slowly starts to slow down in its spinning until it eventually stopped. And that was how it felt for me. It felt like somebody just switched the fan off, and I was just like grinding to a halt. And it was debilitating. It truly was. At this time, I was holding down a full-time job and a single parent caring for my son, and it was extremely difficult, very, very difficult. But I persisted, and within 3 or 4 years of having my son, my body started to go haywire and my tonsils started to flare. So I needed to have a tonsillectomy. Now, having a tonsillectomy as an adult is a slightly different pain threshold to having it as a child, and children generally bounce back. But the consultant told me, he said, it is going to be a very difficult and uncomfortable procedure, but once you've had it, then we get you eating the next day, and once you've started to eat, then we can send you home, and you've got 4 to 6 weeks for your recovery period. So I had my operation, and consultants told me that I was bleeding profusely. They couldn't stem the bleeding, and I bled out a lot, and but they managed to control it. So they kept a careful eye on me, and it was healing, but much slower than anticipated. So within 4 to 6 weeks, the average time of recovering from the procedure, I hadn't recovered at all, nowhere near recovered. So I went back to see my doctor. He had a look. He was really concerned that I hadn't recovered, was having all these symptoms come on again, the swelling, the pain, the fatigue, the anemia. My body just went haywire. Those days I couldn't literally get my head off the pillow. I was in a really bad way. But again, there was no, doctors didn't pick it up that I had lupus. I was never tested for it. So, you know, eventually I recovered from the tonsillectomy. It took a good 3-4 months to recover from a procedure that should have only taken 4 to 6 weeks. We now know that in lupus patients, in many lupus patients, when the body experiences a trauma such as an operation, it can cause havoc with the immune system, and that's why healing can take a long time. And it did in my case, only I hadn't been diagnosed at that point. So I continued living with this condition, living with all these symptoms, the swelling, the pain, the headaches. you know, not being able to bend my fingers, not being able to bend my toes. Then, you know, there was other symptoms as well, such as constantly being cold. I was always cold. I mean, I'm cold now. I've got my scarf on and I've got this woolly cardigan on. Constantly cold. And of course the anemia has always been a problem and a constant throughout my life. So this now leads up to the point at which I was diagnosed, and what brought my diagnosis onto the table was back in 2004, late 2004. I woke up one day just after Christmas, I think it was Boxing Day, and I felt absolutely dreadful. I'd never felt so bad in all my life. I had literally no energy. I couldn't get my head off the pillow. I was absolutely freezing. I was shaking. I couldn't get warm. My head was banging. I was in so much pain. I was swollen. My face had literally become distorted because it was swollen so much. And I thought, immediately, I just thought, I've probably got a virus and I need a few days just to rest and recover. And I did, but these symptoms didn't go away. So went to see the doctor again, didn't know what was wrong, and said need to take plenty of rest and lots of fluids and everything, you'll be okay. A few weeks later, what I found was I started to get winded. So if I'm walking and talking, I would just lose my breath would go. Or if I was having a conversation with somebody, I would just start gasping for air. I started to get winded, and I thought to myself, this doesn't feel right. This is very, very unusual. So went back to the doctor, and doctor said, I'll put you on an inhaler. Could be that. So I was a bit dubious because I've never been diagnosed with asthma before. And it didn't help. And then the feeling winded led into a cough. And my colleagues at work, at my worst point, said, Angela, that's not a cough, that's a bark. It was raucous, and people could hear it right through the building, right through the floor. And when I was coughing, I couldn't catch my breath. I was gasping, I was wheezing. It was terrible. So I went back to my doctor, and doctor said, sounds like you have angina. And I was like, angina? That's just weird that I've, you know, at this point I was in my 30s, I was around 35, and I was like, no, I don't accept that I've got angina. But he sent me off for the test, and as I got to the consultant's office at the hospital, the consultant took one look at me and said, I'm telling you now, you haven't got angina. I said, well, how can you be so sure? He said, because his youngest patient is in their late 70s and I was in my 30s. It was like, you haven't got angina. So again, he did all the tests and confirmed, no, you haven't got angina. So I went back to my doctor, because at this point I knew something was wrong. I couldn't breathe properly. I was gasping for air, gasping for breath. I was just feeling really rotten. Everything was hurting. So he's given me all sorts of things, and it's not working. So this one day I phoned the surgery and I said, I have to see the doctor tonight because I feel terrible. And I'm not even exaggerating. I feel like something is seriously wrong and I need to be seen today. So doctor said, come up to the surgery. And I remember leaving my house, getting to the car, and it turned out the battery in the car was flat, and I literally had no energy to get out of the car and get back up to the house. And I had to call my friend, and he had to come and get me out of the car, get me back into the house and into bed. And he took one look at me and he said, no, you're not, something is seriously wrong. So the next morning he picked me up and he took me to my doctor's surgery, and my doctor took one look at me and he said, Angela, I don't know what is wrong with you. I'll be totally honest, I don't know what's wrong, but you look absolutely dreadful. You need to go straight up to the emergency assessment unit at the hospital. So my friend took me straight up to the hospital, and they started with all their tests. And first of all, they needed to identify why I had this horrendous bark. You'd never heard anything like it before in your life. It was just the most horrendous bark, and every time I barked, I couldn't breathe, I was gasping, I was short of breath, my skin colour was changing, I was doubled over, I was in pain. So they sent me off for an x-ray, and it turned out that they said my heart was larger than expected. So that was a worry. So they sent me down for an echocardiogram, and that is where they do a full scan of the heart. And the results came back that I had a buildup of fluid around the heart, and it was dangerous. It was dangerous. And doctor said that the amount of fluid that I had surrounding my heart, in another couple of weeks, had I not been if I had not been in the hospital and it continued, I could have had a massive heart attack. I'd have been gone. Because what this fluid was doing was constricting the heart from beating properly. It was pumping the fluid into the lungs, and that whole combination was what was causing me to gasp, have shortness of breath, couldn't breathe, barking. I was in a really bad way. So they said, that's it, we're keeping you in, we're gonna monitor you. So then at this point I said, well, you need to know, I don't know if it's connected, but all my life I've suffered with my joints, from my shoulders, my hips, my elbows, my fingers, my toes, my knees. Every joint in my body hurts, it gets swollen. I have all of these other conditions, the migraine headaches, the chronic fatigue. So they called a rheumatology expert. He came down, spoke to me, ran some tests, did some bloods, and came back and said, we know what's wrong with you. You have a condition called lupus. Well, at that point, it was mixed feelings, completely mixed feelings for me. One, I was pleased that what I was experiencing, what I felt, all the symptoms and everything for since I was a child now had a name, because it got to the point where I was going to the doctors constantly, and I'm being made to feel like I'm wasting the doctor's time, I'm draining the resources, and that I'm a bit of a hypochondriac. All the time I knew something was desperately wrong. So now that I had a diagnosis, I was pleased that there was a name for this, all of this that I was experiencing. There was a name for it, and if there's a name, I could get treated. and if I can get treated, there is hope on the horizon that I can make a recovery and I could get better. But at the same time, there was trepidation because I had come across lupus before. There was a young lady that I knew in my teenage years, and she had been diagnosed with lupus and was in a critical way, and she got to the point where the medics advised her family to come in because they didn't expect her to last the night. Her lupus, they just couldn't control the symptoms that she was experiencing. And she developed a virus. Her lupus affected her heart, her brain, her kidneys, and she developed a virus, and they couldn't manage it. They couldn't bring it under control, and her and her family thought that was it. She wasn't going to last the night, but she did, and she started to I'm not say recover, but started to get better. And she still has it, and she lives with the condition, a bit like myself, living with the condition. So I'd heard of lupus, and I knew that it could be life-changing, devastating, and could be fatal. So at that point, my feelings were very mixed. Yes, what I have been experiencing has got a name, but it could have serious consequences and a serious impact on my life. And at the point, I was a single mother, and I had a young son. So knowing that my friend had been diagnosed, it did leave me feeling very mixed emotions. But everybody's lupus journey is different. So once I had my diagnosis of lupus, then it was the beginning of a long journey of managing and treating the condition. So the first thing that happened was I was referred to a cardiologist who looked at my heart scan and put me on a course of treatment of steroids to reduce all the swelling and all the inflammation around my heart. And as my heart started to shrink, I would be getting these pains, these shooting pains, this uncomfortable feeling. So ended up in hospital a couple of times for monitoring. And then they noticed that my heart rhythm wasn't as it should be. But again, they put that down to, you know, the problems related to my heart sort of being affected by the lupus and being enlarged. Over time, again, the pleurisy on my lung, that started to settle. And I went straight onto a drug called azathioprine. And that was a drug that doctors provided for me to sort of, along with prednisolone, in order to sort of bring the lupus under control, because at this point my body was just haywire, and they needed to bring everything under control. The hardest thing for me was not so much the treatment, because I was on a lot of medication, in and out of the doctor's surgery, in and out of the cardiologist's consultant's room. I was seeing the rheumatologist and my GP. So whilst that was challenging and it was difficult, the hardest thing for me was that emotional connection. Because up until that point, yes, I'd always had these ongoing health challenges, these health problems, Whether they were diagnosed or not was a different matter, but there would always be some kind of treatment for it. And I led what I thought was a normal life. But once I got my diagnosis, my life changed, and it took me a long time to accept that I have this life-changing condition. And I think throughout my lupus journey, that has to be one of the hardest things for me. And I went through a period of denial. I was in complete denial. And once I got discharged from hospital, I had a week off work to recover, and then I went straight back into work. And my boss was like, "Are you sure you should be here?" And I was like, "Yes, you know, I'll be absolutely fine," because I just wanted to normalize my life. So a few weeks later, I ended back up in the doctor's surgery, and the doctor asked me, "Are you back at work?" And I explained yes, and he was like, "No." And his words has always stuck with me. His words were that you have a life-threatening, serious health condition. You need to give your illness and your body the respect that it's due. And those were his words. And he told me, you need to go home, you need to rest. So he signed me off work for 6 months, and in that 6 months, that was what I needed to really fully appreciate that I was seriously ill. I was seriously ill, and if I didn't give my illness the respect that it is due, I could no longer be here. And that wasn't something I wanted with a young child. So I had to learn to slow down, to let other people look after me, and to really look after myself. Because in my head I was like, I'm not as ill as the doctors are making out. So when I relapsed and had another serious lupus flare, it put me back into hospital because my heart started to get inflamed again. The joints weren't working as they should, and my bark had started to come back. It was at this point that I thought, no, I really need to take this seriously, which I did. But that really was the hardest part for me. It was the denial, going into denial and accepting that I was seriously ill. And, you know, in honesty, I look back and I think that the condition was always there and it was bubbling away. But when I had, you know, stresses in my life, such as pregnancy, having the tonsillectomy, it came full blown. But it came with a vengeance when I was under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure in my senior job. I was working very, very long hours. I had a lot of stress, a lot of pressure in that senior role. And I think that was the catalyst where my body was just pushed to breaking point, and my body said, no, no more. And it took me a long time then to rewind from that, because it was something I'd worked for, and now my body was saying, no, this isn't for you. So I had to, and that's where the denial came in, because when I was diagnosed, I just thought, I can't give up this job and this life that I've had. I just bought a new house, bought this car, had all of this lifestyle going on, and I was like, there's no way I can give it up. Well, lupus always wins. Lupus always wins. Your body always wins. And after I'd been diagnosed, a year and a half to 2 years later, I was forced to give up the job because I was off sick so much. I just had to give the job up. So I gave the job up, and my life has completely changed. But in terms of managing my lupus, it's taken a long time. I've been diagnosed now for 15 years. I've been diagnosed, but I've lived with lupus for over 50 years. Lots of people live with symptoms that are typical of lupus, such as, you know, the conditions I mentioned earlier, and many people are never diagnosed, or are diagnosed when it's too late. So it is a very serious condition, and you know, we need to raise awareness. There's more awareness needs to be raised about lupus. And now there are a couple of high profile celebrities that have been diagnosed with lupus and are speaking about it, raising the profile. And celebrities such as Selena Gomez, who suffers with lupus nephritis, and that is related to her kidneys and has had to have a kidney transplant. There's Toni Braxton, the singer, Nick Cannon. Lady Gaga has also mentioned lupus, that it's a condition she suffers with, and is raising awareness about it. And I'm sure there's lots and lots of others. Those are just a few off the top of my head. But yes, it's a disability, and it can be really disabling. So yes, so let's say 15 years after my diagnosis, my life has completely changed. I take medication that I've been on for years. Once I started being treated for the lupus, I was put on hydroxychloroquine and prednisolone. So that's my story, guys, about being diagnosed with lupus. So do look out for my next videos. Please like and subscribe. So guys, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon.